June 6, 1944. 5:00 a.m., Crisbecq Battery, Normandy coast. The binoculars quivered in the hands of Oberleutnant Walter Ohmsen as he swept them across the horizon, imprinting in his mind an image that would haunt him forever. Through the pale haze of dawn, he saw a sight that shattered every promise from the High Command. The English Channel, long regarded as the Reich's protective moat, had become a steel highway, an endless armada stretching from edge to edge of the horizon, its dark silhouettes fusing into one unbroken mass of advancing doom. The invasion fleet was staggering, 6,939 vessels in total, 1,113 warships, 4,113 warships, all crewed by more than 95,000 naval personnel from 8 Allied nations. At 5:52 a.m., Ohmsen's battery received the command to open fire. 3 minutes later, at 5:55 a.m., the first shells from his two 10mm checkmate Skoda cannons arced toward the oncoming armada, drops of water against a rising tsunami. His gunners engaged the American cruisers USS Tuscaloosa and USS Quincy, as well as the battleship USS Nevada. At 6:30 a.m., one of his rounds struck home, destroying the USS Corrie, the only U.S. destroyer lost on D-Day. From his concrete observation post atop Crisbecq Battery, the 32-year-old naval officer had just become the first German defender to sight and fire upon the Allied invasion of Fortress Europe. Yet what Ohmsen saw through his Zeiss rangefinder was not merely an armada, it was the living embodiment of an industrial might that Nazi propaganda had sworn could not exist. The mathematics of defeat were closing in at 8 knots. The transformation had begun. Within hours, officers across Normandy would witness an avalanche of Allied material power that shattered every assumption, marking the true beginning of the end for Hitler's so-called thousand-year Reich. The darkness of June 5th had carried ominous warnings. At Army Group B headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, 50 miles inland, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel since April 15th, studied alarming reports. Rommel himself was absent, back in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday, convinced that poor weather precluded any landing. But at 1:20 a.m., the 7th Army confirmed mass parachute drops across Normandy. The 82nd and 21st Airborne Divisions, over 13,000 men, were descending from swarms of Douglas C-47 Skytrains. General d'Artillerie, Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps from Saint-Lô, grasped the meaning immediately. A hardened veteran of the Eastern Front, scarred and maimed at Stalingrad, Marx's instincts had been honed to a razor's edge. Yet even he, among the Wehrmacht's most battle-hardened commanders, could not fathom the scale of what approached. The Germans had prepared for an invasion. They had not prepared for an industrial avalanche that would bury them under sheer material supremacy. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, appointed naval advisor to Rommel in late 1943, had spent months inspecting coastal defenses. Born into a seafaring family in 1894, Ruge understood maritime warfare better than any officer in France. He had demanded more mines, more obstacles, more heavy guns. But later, in his memoir Rommel in Normandy, he would write, "We were preparing to fight the last war. They were bringing the next one." German planners had convinced themselves the Allies could muster perhaps 20 divisions supported by 3,000 ships. These assumptions were born from their own limitations, their exhaustion, their dwindling resources, their war-scarred imagination. By dawn on June 6th, as the first grey light swept the Normandy coast, German observers in bunkers and posts from Cherbourg to Le Havre were forced to confront the unthinkable. Not hundreds of ships, thousands. Not a raid, not a feint, but the largest amphibious invasion in human history. At Strong Point, WN-62, overlooking the strip of sand that would soon be known as Omaha Beach, Gefreiter Heinrich Severloh pressed his face to the embrasure of his machine gun nest at 5:45 a.m. The 20-year-old farm boy from Metzingen had never seen the ocean before his posting in Normandy. Now, he saw no ocean at all, only steel. Ships everywhere. So I would later recall in his memoir. Big ships, small ships, fat ships, with flat bottoms. Destroyers racing back and forth like sheepdogs. The horizon was gone. I tried to count, but gave up at 100. There were thousands. Across the 50-mile invasion front, German defenders shared the same dawning realization. This was not simply superior numbers, it was a different order of magnitude. At 5:30 a.m., the naval bombardment began. 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 monitors unleashed their fury. For the Germans, it was their first encounter with American industrial mathematics. The USS Texas alone hurled 255 shells from her 14-inch guns in the opening hour, each round weighing 1,400 pounds. In just 60 minutes, one ship delivered 78 tons of explosives, more than many German artillery regiments held in total supply. By the time the first soldiers set foot on French sand, Allied ships had already fired 50,000 shells from destroyers, 23,000 from cruisers, and 3,500 from battleships, a staggering 30,000 tons of ordnance. General der Infanterie Gunther Blument, Chief of Staff to the Oberbefehlshaber West, would later testify, "We had prepared to fight soldiers. We found ourselves fighting factories." At 6:01 a.m., as the Atlantic Wall buckled under naval fire, the second wave of Allied supremacy arrived. The sky filled not with dozens, not with hundreds, but with thousands of aircraft. Allied pilots flew more than 14,000 sorties in direct support of the landings, having secured complete air supremacy before dawn. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin across France, had barely 300 operational aircraft. On D-Day, they managed 319 sorties. The Allies flew 14,000. For every German plane in the air, there were 46 Allied fighters overhead. The mathematics weren't unfavorable. They were absurd. Major Josef Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, led the only Luftwaffe attack on the invasion beaches that morning. With just his wingman, Heinz Wodarczyk, he made a single strafing pass over Sword Beach, before fleeing from swarms of Allied fighters. The episode, immortalized in multiple accounts, exposed the utter impotence of German air power. Yet, even in the face of such odds, some defenders still believed they might hold. At Omaha, the 32nd Infantry Division occupied formidable positions on the bluffs. Their bunkers and interlocking MG-42s turned the shoreline into a killing ground. When the Americans of the 1st and 29th Divisions hit the sand at 6:30 a.m., they marched into a storm of fire. From his post at WN-62, Heinrich Severloh fired more than 12,000 rounds that morning, a fact preserved in his own testimony. He saw Americans fall by the dozens, then the hundreds. Bodies drifted in the tide. The beach stained red with blood. For a moment it seemed the Atlantic Wall might hold. Then the destroyers came. At 8:00 a.m., with Omaha Beach on the brink of disaster and General Omar Bradley weighing evacuation, American destroyers made an audacious choice. Ignoring the danger of grounding or mines, they drove straight toward the shore, closing to within 1,000 yards. Point-blank range, naval guns unleashed hell. The USS McCook, USS Carmack, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt swung their 5-inch guns onto German strongpoints. At point-blank range, they couldn't miss. Naval records confirmed this action was decisive in shattering the defenses at Omaha. This was the moment German officers grasped the true meaning of American industrial might. It wasn't just the number of ships, it was the audacity to risk them. To treat destroyers as expendable tools. The USS Corrie had already been lost, but replacements slid instantly into position for the Kriegsmarine. A ship was an irreplaceable jewel. For the U.S. Navy, ships were instruments, and America had thousands more. As the morning wore on, German observers watched in disbelief as the invasion unfolded in ways they had never imagined possible. The landing craft did not stop. Wave after wave, hour after hour, an endless conveyor belt of men and machines surged from sea to shore. Specialized vessels astonished the defenders. Landing craft tanks, LCTs, dropped 30-ton Shermans directly onto the sand. Landing ship tanks, LSTs, 28-foot steel giants, rammed themselves ashore, opened their vast bow doors, and disgorged entire companies of armor. With amphibious trucks swam through the surf, rolled up the beaches, and delivered supplies straight to the front. By nightfall, the Allies had landed approximately 56,000 troops, 132,715 by sea, 23,400 by air. This force exceeded the strength of the entire German 7th Army holding Normandy. Within the first 24 hours, Allied records show the landing of 56,000 personnel, 20,000 vehicles, 1,700 tanks, and 15,000 tons of supplies. By comparison, the German 7th Army fielded fewer than 500 operational tanks. The Allies put 3 times that number ashore on the first day alone. The German response exposed not just material inferiority, but systemic paralysis. The vaunted panzer divisions, which had crushed France in 6 weeks in 1940, now found themselves chained by Allied air power and naval gunnery. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored force close enough to intervene, launched its counterattack at 4:00 p.m. Yet it took 3 agonizing hours to move just 10 miles from Cayenne to Renville. What should have been a decisive armored thrust became a funeral procession of burning wrecks. When the survivors finally reached British lines near Sword Beach, they met naval fire guided by forward observers. From 15 miles offshore, HMS Warspite opened up with her 15-inch guns, shells capable of punching through any tank ever built. SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, commander of the 25th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment, later wrote in his memoir, "The enemy's material superiority was so great that our own strength was swept away like a wave breaking upon rock." By June 7th, D-Day. Hull 1 reconnaissance aircraft brought back photographs so astounding that senior German officers refused to believe them. The Allies were not capturing harbors, they were building them. The Mulberry harbors rose from the open sea, artificial ports assembled piece by piece, a feat of engineering and industry on a scale that defied imagination. Prefabricated in Britain, the artificial ports, Mulberry harbors, were feats of engineering genius. 600,000 tons of concrete, 33 jetties, 10 miles of floating roadways, and 93 scuttled ships forming breakwaters. Within 2 weeks, these man-made harbors were unloading 9,000 tons of supplies daily, more than many of France's actual ports. The Germans had spent 4 years fortifying the Atlantic Wall to defend ports. The Allies had simply eliminated the need for ports. By late June 1944, German commanders began to grasp the scale of their intelligence failure. The elaborate deception of Operation Fortitude had convinced them that Normandy was a diversion, that the real invasion would fall at Pas-de-Calais, spearheaded by Patton's fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group. For weeks, precious German reserves stood idle, waiting for an invasion that never came. General der Panzertruppe Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, commanding Panzer Group West, finally realized the truth when captured documents revealed Patton's very real Third Army was already in Normandy. As June turned to July, reports to German High Command grew desperate. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, received a call from Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel at OKW, demanding to know why the invasion had not been thrown back into the sea. Rundstedt's reply was blunt: "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" For his honesty, he was relieved of command. On June 17th, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel met Hitler at Margiville, presenting hard statistics. Allied air supremacy, divisions at 30% strength, daylight movement rendered suicidal by naval guns. Rommel declared the situation hopeless. Hitler's response: forbid retreat, demand fanatical resistance. Rommel left convinced Germany was doomed. Within a month he would be implicated in the July 20th assassination plot and forced to take his own life. His chief of staff, Hans Speidel, later wrote in Invasion 1944, "We were not defeated by better soldiers or superior strategy. We were buried under an avalanche of material." The avalanche only grew. On July 7th, 467 RAF heavy bombers dropped 2,500 tons of bombs on Caussem, and just 40 minutes more destructive power than the entire Luftwaffe possessed in France. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, one of Germany's elite formations, entered Normandy with 20,540 men and 150 tanks. After 6 weeks, it counted just 300 survivors and no tanks, losing 8,000 in the Falaise Pocket alone. Operation Cobra. The American breakout on July 25th unleashed the most devastating demonstration yet. 1,005 fighter bombers, threaders and T-300 tons of bombs onto a target zone just 6,000 by 2,200 yards. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzerlehr, reported bitterly, "My division has been annihilated. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an industrial complex." Panzerlehr, which had entered Normandy with 90 tanks and 16,000 men, was obliterated. Of 3,000 men caught in the bombing zone, 1,000 died instantly, 1,000 were wounded, and 1,000 were too shattered to fight. The cost included tragedy: 71 Americans killed and 490 wounded in friendly fire, among them Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the highest-ranking U.S. officer killed in Europe. Yet even this loss barely slowed the operation. The Falaise Pocket, August 12-21, became the graveyard of German forces in Normandy. Documented losses were staggering: 10,000, 15,000 killed, 40,000, 50,000 captured, 30, 40,000, 50,000 captured, 30, 40,000, 50,000 killed, abandoned, 25 U artillery pieces lost. Another 20,000, 50,000 escaped, but only as broken remnants. The numbers revealed a brutal truth. Germany was not fighting a campaign, it was fighting an equation. 1944 production comparison. Germany, 39,008 aircraft, 1,008. United States, 96,000 aircraft, 29,000 tanks, 650,000 trucks, and that excluded British, Canadian, and Soviet production. Total U.S. wartime output dwarfed Germany's 29,007 aircraft, 93,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million trucks, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Former General Staff Chief Franz Halder later calculated that by 1944, Allied production advantage stood at 5-1-10-1 in key categories like trucks. "We were not defeated," one German officer reflected. "We were mathematically eliminated." For those who survived Normandy, the psychological impact was profound. They had witnessed not just military defeat, but the destruction of Nazi ideology itself. The myth of German superiority and American weakness collapsed. Young officers, raised on propaganda that Americans were soft and decadent, instead found an enemy with limitless machines, endless ammunition, radios in every squad, and confidence born of abundance. Suicides among German officers spiked. Defeat could be endured, but the collapse of their worldview, that was unbearable. Beyond sheer numbers, German officers confronted a technology gap that exposed how far behind they had fallen. Proximity. Fuses turned anti-aircraft fire into precision weapons. Radar-directed naval gunfire struck miles inland with first-round accuracy. Amphibious trucks like the DUKW solved logistics problems the Wehrmacht could not even imagine. Specialized vehicles left lasting impressions. Hobart's funnies engineered tanks that cleared mines, laid bridges, and crushed bunkers demonstrated an Allied philosophy of solving tactical problems with machinery, not manpower. Above all, German commanders developed a unique dread of naval gunfire. The battleship, HMS Rodney, hurled 16-inch shells weighing 2,448 pounds up to 23 miles inland. The USS Nevada, USS Texas, and HMS Warspite functioned as mobile super-heavy artillery, obliterating any target. German batteries learned the futility of counterfire. Ships moved, and they shot back. By July, daylight movement had become nearly impossible. Allied fighter bombers, stacked in cab ranks and directed by forward observers, could strike any target within minutes. The imbalance was staggering. 12,000 Allied aircraft in theater versus 300-500 German planes. Daily Allied sorties ranged from 5,000 to 8,000. German sorties, when possible, numbered 50 to 100. The final statistics from Normandy told the story of industrial war. June 6, August 30. Personnel landed. Vehicles landed 43. Supplies landed 3,982,509 tons. Allied sorties 4,000. German losses 40,000 killed, 200,000 captured. Tanks, assault guns lost. Divisions destroyed 4. A decade later, in 1954, surviving German officers gathered in Bonn for a private symposium on Normandy. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, former chief of staff to both Rundstedt and Kluge, delivered the keynote. We learned in Normandy that war had changed fundamentally. It was no longer a contest of armies, but of economic systems. We counted divisions while they counted factories. We measured courage while they measured production. The image that haunts me still is American bulldozers pushing aside our wrecked tanks to clear roads for their supply trucks. The officers who had lived through D-Day were permanently changed. Hans Speidel became a NATO general, helping integrate West Germany into the Western Alliance. Others championed European economic unity, convinced that only pooled resources could ever match American output. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who fought in Italy, compared his front with Normandy. In Italy, we could fight the Allies on relatively equal terms. In Normandy, where they deployed their full industrial might, our forces were simply erased. On June 6, 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Walter Ohmsen, the former Oberleutnant zur See, who had fired the first German shells at the invasion fleet, returned to Crisbecq battery. At 73, standing once more in his old observation post, he addressed veterans of both sides. 40 years ago, I stood here and saw the impossible, a sea of ships from horizon to horizon. In that moment, I knew everything we had been told was wrong. Weak nations do not build 7,000 ships. Divided nations do not coordinate such an invasion. I fired my guns at that armada. It was like throwing stones at the tide. We sank one destroyer, damaged a few others. For every ship we hit, 100 passed untouched. Today's young officers, he reflected, study tactics from Normandy. But the real lesson was simpler. In modern war, the side that produces the most wins. The armada he saw on that gray June morning was not just an invasion fleet. It was American industry, made visible. The Germans, who watched nearly 7,000 Allied ships cross the Channel, understood with terrible clarity. This was more than an invasion. It was the future of war, where industrial capacity eclipsed courage, strategy, and tradition. Their defeat was not military, but mathematical, not tactical, but industrial. Not a failure of bravery, but a shortage of trucks. It was a lesson written in steel across the English Channel on June 6, 1944, when nearly 7,000 ships announced that American industry had come to Europe, and nothing would ever be the same again.